It all began when everything seemed to be falling apart. The cracks had been there for years, subtle at first, but as time went on, they became impossible to ignore. I had always been proud of my family, my wife, Emily, and our 2 kids. We lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs of Chicago, where the American dream seemed within reach. But beneath the surface, things were anything but perfect. Emily and I had been married for 15 years. I thought we had built something solid, but the truth was, she had checked out long before I noticed. I was too consumed by my career to realize it. I'm a successful broker, and I'd worked long hours to provide for our family. Emily didn't have to work, so she spent her days at home with the kids or out with friends. But as the years passed, I noticed a shift in her. The love seemed to fade, replaced with cold indifference. It started with the small things, late nights, vague excuses, distant looks when we spoke. She became increasingly secretive, always on her phone, never fully present. When I tried to confront her about it, she would brush me off, claiming I was just being paranoid. I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, everything changed. I had come home early from work, expecting a quiet evening with Emily. Instead, I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch, looking as though she had just seen a ghost. Her phone was lying next to her, face up. The text message was clear, though: "I can't wait to see you tonight. We're finally free." I froze. My heart dropped into my stomach. The message was from someone named Jason, a name I'd never heard before. It wasn't the first time I had seen something suspicious, but this felt different. This was a direct admission. When I asked her about it, she hesitated, then confessed that she had been seeing someone for the past 6 months. It was like a punch to the gut. She didn't even seem remorseful, just resigned to the fact that everything we had built was a lie. Emily's betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. I couldn't believe it. The woman I had trusted, the mother of my children, had been unfaithful to me for months. As much as I wanted to shout, to cry, to scream, I kept my composure. We agreed that we needed to talk things through, but deep down, I knew it was over. There was no coming back from this. The next few weeks were a blur of pain and anger. I moved out of our house and rented an apartment nearby. Emily took the kids, and we tried to figure out how to handle the situation. But Emily wasn't making things easy. She wasn't content with just ending our marriage, she wanted more. She wanted the house, the car, and a hefty chunk of the savings I had worked so hard to accumulate. I didn't want to fight, but I knew I couldn't let her walk away with everything. We hired lawyers and prepared for what seemed like an inevitable divorce battle. My lawyer, Greg Miller, was an old family friend, a man I trusted, but Emily's lawyer, Laura Jennings, was a different breed entirely. Laura was known for being ruthless, she didn't play by the rules, and she had a reputation for getting clients what they wanted, no matter the cost. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread whenever I thought about facing her in court. Emily's demands were unreasonable, to say the least. She wanted half of everything I had, including my business interests, the house, and even a portion of the future inheritance I was set to receive. I didn't want to fight her over money, but I knew I couldn't just roll over. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to stand my ground. I couldn't let her destroy me both emotionally and financially. The day of the trial arrived, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to lose everything. My lawyer and I sat in the courtroom, waiting for Emily and her lawyer to make their move. When they walked in, Emily barely acknowledged me. She was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, her hair styled to perfection, and her face showed no signs of guilt. It was as if the woman who had betrayed me was nothing more than a stranger sitting across the room. The trial was a grueling process. Laura Jennings wasted no time in launching into her attack, painting me as a neglectful husband and an absent father. She painted Emily as the victim, claiming that I had been too focused on my career to notice the cracks in our marriage. It was a complete reversal of the truth, but I wasn't sure if the judge would see through it. Laura was skilled, and I was struggling to keep my emotions in check. Emily sat quietly, her arms crossed, as if she was detached from the entire process. She barely spoke, leaving everything to Laura. But when the judge asked her to testify, things took a surprising turn. "I have something I need to say," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "The child I'm raising with my husband is not his." The words hung in the air, like a bombshell exploding in the courtroom. Everyone turned to look at her in disbelief. I couldn't comprehend what she was saying. The child we had raised together for years, our son, wasn't mine. Emily's confession sent shockwaves through the room. I felt as though the ground had been pulled out from under me. My heart raced, and for the first time in years, I felt completely and utterly powerless. My world, the life I had built, was crumbling around me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Olivia Smith, didn't seem as shocked as the rest of us. She looked at Emily with a mixture of disdain and disbelief, but she didn't immediately react. Instead, she turned to her lawyer and then to me, asking if I had any response to Emily's statement. I was speechless. What could I say? Emily had admitted to cheating, and now she was trying to take everything from me. My lawyer, Greg, urged me to remain calm, but I could feel the anger building inside me. I wanted to lash out, to confront Emily, to scream at her for everything she had done. But I knew I had to keep my composure. This was a game now, and I had to play it to win. Judge Smith looked at Emily again, then at me, and then made a recommendation that no one in the room was expecting. Given the seriousness of this case, I suggest we immediately file a counterclaim. We will start a second trial if necessary. It is clear that there are serious issues at play here, and it would be wise to address them thoroughly. Emily's face turned pale at the suggestion. She hadn't expected to be called out so quickly, and she clearly hadn't anticipated the severity of her confession. But there was no going back now. As the trial adjourned for the day, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory, but also dread. Emily had opened the door to a much bigger battle. And now, with the counterclaim in place, I had the chance to expose everything, every betrayal, every lie. And I wasn't going to stop until I had justice. The next few days after the trial felt like a whirlwind. My life had been shattered, and yet, somehow, it felt like the pieces were slowly falling back into place. Emily's admission in court had been a seismic shift. She had not only confirmed her infidelity but also unknowingly opened the door for me to expose everything she had done. My lawyer, Greg, was confident that this would work in my favor, but even he knew we had to be careful in how we proceeded. As I sat at my new apartment, looking out over the Chicago skyline, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too surreal. The life I had known, my family, my business, my future, was slipping through my fingers. But one thing was clear, I wasn't going to let Emily walk away with my hard-earned assets, especially after what she'd done. Greg called me the morning after the trial to inform me that we had officially filed the counterclaim. It was a strategic move, one that would ensure a deeper investigation into Emily's actions, and it meant that the court would now consider everything, not just the divorce, but the full extent of her infidelity and how it had impacted our family. Emily had no idea what was coming. I wasn't just going to let her get away with destroying our family. I had my own plan now, and I was going to make sure that Emily paid for everything. I needed to gather as much evidence as possible to ensure that the court could see the full extent of her lies. But more than that, I needed to expose the people who had helped her along the way, the people who had been complicit in her deceit. In the days that followed, I hired a private investigator named Charlie Stevens. Charlie was a seasoned professional, a man in his early 40s who looked like someone who had seen the darkest parts of the world. He was lean, with short cropped hair and a rugged demeanor that suggested he could track down a person even if they were hiding in the most remote corners of the earth. His specialty was in gathering evidence for divorce cases, particularly those involving infidelity. I needed him on my side. When I first met Charlie in a nondescript coffee shop in downtown Chicago, he immediately got to work. He listened intently as I recounted everything I knew about Emily's affairs, her late nights, the text messages, the phone calls, and most importantly, the affair with Jason, the man she had been seeing for 6 months. Charlie took notes, asking specific questions, before telling me he'd need a week to gather all the information he could. I trusted him. He was thorough, methodical, and understood exactly how to expose someone without them realizing they were being watched. Meanwhile, Emily continued to play the role of the victim. She was doing everything she could to make me look like the villain. Her lawyer, Laura Jennings, had been even more aggressive in her tactics. They were both trying to turn the court of public opinion against me. But I wasn't about to let that happen. The counterclaim had opened up a whole new world of possibilities, and I wasn't going to waste it. A week passed, and Charlie's investigation bore fruit. He had gathered irrefutable evidence that Emily's affair with Jason wasn't just a fling, it was an ongoing relationship. He had tracked their interactions, obtained photos of them meeting in secret locations, and even intercepted text messages that detailed their plans to run away together. But the most damning evidence came when he uncovered a shocking piece of information: Jason wasn't the only man Emily had been seeing during our marriage. Charlie had discovered multiple instances where Emily had been involved with other men I had never known about. Some were co-workers, others were acquaintances, and there were even a few that had been longtime friends of ours. I couldn't believe it. The woman I had loved, the woman I had trusted, had been living a double life, lying to me every day. I wasn't sure how to process this new information. My heart ached with betrayal, but at the same time, I knew that this was my chance to take control. This wasn't just about getting the divorce settled, this was about exposing Emily for the deceitful, manipulative person she had become. With the evidence in hand, we prepared for the next stage of the trial. Emily had no idea what was coming. I had arranged for Charlie to present the evidence in court, and we had compiled a dossier of text messages, photos, and witness statements that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Emily had been unfaithful in multiple ways. But that wasn't all. I also made sure to bring in some key witnesses, people who had been around when Emily had been carrying on these affairs. One of them was my brother, Mark. Mark was in his early 30s, a quiet man with a strong sense of integrity. He had always been close to me, and I had trusted him with everything. But it turned out that he had been one of the people Emily had confided in during her affairs. He had no idea I was aware of it, but when I spoke to him privately, he admitted that Emily had even asked him for advice on how to leave me without losing too much in the divorce. Mark had been hesitant to get involved, but when I explained that I needed his testimony, he agreed to help. Another key witness was Jason himself. I had tracked him down through Charlie, and I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to get him on the stand. Jason was a tall, well-built man in his late 30s, with a scruffy beard and a confident attitude. He had been seeing Emily for months, and when I confronted him about it, he acted as though he had done nothing wrong. But the truth was clear: he had been complicit in the destruction of my family. The day of the next hearing arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Emily sat across from me, her arms crossed, her face as cold as ever. Laura Jennings was at her side, whispering in her ear. I could see the unease in Emily's eyes as she realized things weren't going as planned. She had thought that her confession would be enough to turn the tide in her favor, but she had no idea what I had in store for her. The hearing began with a quiet murmur in the courtroom as the judge, Judge Olivia Smith, called the session to order. The first thing Emily's lawyer, Laura, did was try to present Emily's case for why she deserved a larger portion of the property. But before she could get too far, I stood up and asked the judge if I could present my evidence. Judge Smith looked at me, raising an eyebrow, but then nodded for me to proceed. Greg Miller handed over the dossier that Charlie had prepared. The room fell silent as the evidence was presented. Photos of Emily and Jason together, their text exchanges, the statements from witnesses, all of it was laid out for the judge to see. I could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom on me as the truth came to light. When Jason took the stand, his demeanor changed. He no longer looked confident. As he was cross-examined by Greg, he stammered and tried to deflect responsibility. But it was clear to everyone that he had been complicit in the affair. And when Mark took the stand, his testimony was even more damning. He confirmed that Emily had been planning her exit strategy from our marriage for months and had sought his advice on how to proceed without losing everything. The look on Emily's face as the evidence piled up was one I will never forget. It was a mix of shock, disbelief, and fear. She had underestimated me. And now, she was about to pay the price. As the courtroom session continued, I could feel the tide turning in my favor. Emily, once so confident in her ability to manipulate the situation, was now visibly sweating. I had watched her during the proceedings, trying to keep her composure, but the cracks were starting to show. Her usual cold, calculating demeanor was replaced by uncertainty, and her lawyer, Laura Jennings, who had been so aggressive just days before, now seemed almost powerless against the weight of the evidence I had presented. The judge, Judge Olivia Smith, remained silent, taking everything in. Her eyes flickered over the documents and the photos with the professionalism of someone who had seen many cases like ours, but I could tell she was shocked. No one expects to see the personal life of a family laid bare in such an unforgiving light. The courtroom was eerily quiet, save for the sound of Greg Miller, my lawyer, methodically walking through each piece of evidence. It wasn't just about the photos or the text messages anymore. It was about Emily's arrogance, her complete disregard for our family and the vows she had made. For the first time in a long while, I felt a strange sense of power, the kind of power that comes from knowing the truth is on your side. It was like watching someone who had been in control for so long finally start to lose their grip. And I was enjoying every minute of it. Greg moved on to the witness statements next, and I saw Emily's face drain of color as the witnesses took the stand one by one. First, it was Mark, my brother, who explained how Emily had confided in him, asking for advice on how to handle our marriage and what to do to ensure she wouldn't lose out in the divorce. Mark's voice was calm, but there was a quiet anger behind it. He was deeply ashamed of what Emily had done, and the guilt had eaten away at him for months. But now, he was finally speaking the truth. Then came Jason, the man who had been having an affair with Emily. He was cocky when he entered the courtroom, wearing a tailored suit and his typical smug smile, but as the testimony wore on, his bravado began to fade. The more Greg asked him about their secret meetings, the texts they'd exchanged, and their plans to run away together, the more Jason seemed to shrink. He tried to deny some of the evidence, but the photos and text messages were undeniable. His hands shook slightly, and his voice wavered as he finally admitted to the affair and to knowing that Emily had been lying to me for months. It was clear Jason had underestimated the situation. He thought he could just slip away after the affair was exposed, but now he found himself tangled in the web of Emily's lies, with no easy way out. When Greg asked him if he had ever considered the consequences of his actions, Jason mumbled something about love, but it didn't feel sincere. He wasn't the kind of man who regretted his choices, he was just afraid of getting caught. But it wasn't just the affair that was being exposed, it was Emily's entire character. Her lies were laid out like a puzzle that had been carefully constructed over the years. I had been blinded by love and loyalty for so long, but now, with each passing moment, I saw her for who she really was. And I wasn't the only one. As the day wore on, I could see Emily beginning to unravel. Her hands, which had been tightly clasped in her lap earlier, were now fidgeting with her wedding ring. She kept glancing at her lawyer, but Laura wasn't offering any help. The evidence was damning, and there was nothing she could do to save Emily now. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. The woman who had once been my partner, my confidant, the mother of my child, was now exposed as a fraud. But there was no time for pity. It was my turn. Greg had asked me to take the stand, and after a brief moment of hesitation, I agreed. I had been silent throughout the trial, letting the evidence speak for itself. But now, it was time to say my piece. I wasn't going to let Emily get away with painting me as the villain. I wasn't going to let her rewrite our history. As I stood up and walked to the witness box, the room fell silent again. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me, the judge, the lawyers, the spectators who had come to see the drama unfold. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. It was time to speak the truth. Your Honor, I began, my voice steady but firm. I never thought I would be standing here today, in this courtroom, exposing my wife for the things she's done. But I am here because I want the truth to be known. I loved Emily. I gave her everything I had, everything I could. And yet, she betrayed me in the worst way possible. The words came easier than I had imagined. As I spoke, I could feel the years of hurt, of betrayal, of anger, lifting off my shoulders. It was cathartic, in a way, to finally say the things I had been holding in for so long. I trusted her with my life, with my heart, and with my child. But instead of honoring that trust, she chose to lie to me, to deceive me. She had an affair. She had multiple affairs. And she thought she could get away with it. But now, the truth is here for everyone to see. I paused for a moment, my eyes scanning the courtroom. I could see Emily's face reddening as she realized the weight of what I was saying. Her eyes darted between me and the judge, but she couldn't escape the truth. I'm not here to seek revenge. I'm here because I want justice. I want to protect my child, and I want to ensure that Emily doesn't walk away from this unscathed. She doesn't deserve the life she wants to take from me. She doesn't deserve to profit from her lies and betrayal. There was a long pause. I could see Emily's eyes watering, but it didn't matter anymore. The truth had come out, and there was no turning back. The judge looked at me for a moment before addressing the room. Thank you, Mr. Lawson. We will reconvene tomorrow to hear the final arguments. In the meantime, I suggest that we all take a moment to consider the gravity of what has been presented here today. As I left the witness stand, I felt a sense of closure, of resolution. The battle wasn't over yet, but I knew that I had won the first round. Emily had been exposed for who she truly was, and there was no hiding it now. The next day in court, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Emily had spent the night stewing over the evidence presented against her, and it was clear she wasn't prepared for the outcome. I could tell she was trying to maintain her composure, but there was something in her eyes that had shifted overnight. The arrogance that once defined her demeanor had now been replaced by fear. Fear that her secrets were coming to light in ways she never anticipated. As we sat down in the courtroom once again, I felt a sense of anticipation. The judge, Judge Olivia Smith, called the session to order, her gavel banging firmly against the wood. We will now proceed with the next phase of the trial, she announced, her tone professional but carrying an undercurrent of something more, perhaps even a hint of frustration. After all, cases like ours weren't the norm. Divorce cases rarely spiraled into full-blown public spectacles. Greg Miller, my lawyer, stood up first, ready to make his argument. He was a man of few words but deadly precision. He had spent the last few weeks preparing me for this moment, guiding me through the ups and downs of the legal process. His calm, level-headed demeanor was a stark contrast to Emily's lawyer, Laura Jennings, who had already begun shifting nervously in her seat. But what happened next was not what any of us had expected. Emily stood up abruptly, her voice shaking as she addressed the judge. Your Honor, I would like to file a counterclaim, she said, her eyes darting around the room, refusing to meet anyone's gaze for too long. It was a move I hadn't anticipated. Greg shot me a quick glance, his brows furrowing in confusion. Emily hadn't mentioned anything about filing a counterclaim in our prior discussions. She had been so focused on the property settlement that we never thought she'd try to fight the custody and child support issues. But this was Emily we were talking about, the same woman who had used manipulation to get her way for years. I sat back in my chair, trying to remain composed, but internally, I was preparing for the worst. Emily was a master of turning situations in her favor, and I had no idea what she had planned. Judge Smith raised an eyebrow. What exactly is the nature of this counterclaim, Mrs. Lawson? Emily took a deep breath before speaking, clearly trying to gather her thoughts. Your Honor, I have come to realize that certain facts have not been properly addressed in this case, she began, her voice trying to sound calm but tinged with an edge of desperation. I am requesting that this trial be suspended so that I can submit a formal counterclaim regarding Mr. Lawson's conduct and the legitimacy of his accusations. I could see Laura Jennings trying to hold back a smile, clearly believing that Emily had a plan to twist things in her favor. But I wasn't going to let her get away with it. Emily continued, her words cutting through the courtroom. It is with great regret that I admit, the child in question is not Mr. Lawson's. I have cheated on him repeatedly during our marriage, and the paternity test results have already been sent to the court. I have nothing further to say about this matter except that it has been a painful realization for me as well. The words hit me like a punch to the gut, but it wasn't the revelation of her infidelity that stung the most, it was the cold, calculated way she delivered them, as though she was making a business transaction instead of exposing the depths of her betrayal. The courtroom gasped. A wave of whispers spread through the room like wildfire. Even the judge looked taken aback, her mouth slightly agape. I had known in my heart for a long time that Emily had been unfaithful, but hearing her admit it so publicly, in such a stark and matter-of-fact manner, felt like a betrayal all over again. It felt like she was trying to absolve herself, to cast blame on me in our marriage, as though her actions had no consequences. But I wasn't about to let her take the easy way out. Greg stood up immediately, his voice sharp as he addressed the judge. Your Honor, if I may, we request that this admission be struck from the record. The defendant's conduct is an attempt to shift blame and confuse the issue. Mrs. Lawson had ample opportunity to address these concerns prior to the trial, yet she has chosen to present them at the most inconvenient time, hoping it will sway the court in her favor. The judge nodded in agreement, her expression now steely. I will allow Mrs. Lawson to file a formal counterclaim. However, it will be thoroughly reviewed, and we will not tolerate any attempts to delay the proceedings. Emily's face reddened with frustration as she sat down, but I could see her steely resolve behind the anger. She had been backed into a corner, and now, she was lashing out, trying to salvage whatever she could from this mess. As the day progressed, Emily's lawyer, Laura, presented the counterclaim in the most unconvincing way possible. It was clear she was grasping at straws, trying to shift the focus from Emily's actions to my so-called misconduct during our marriage. The accusations were wild, unfounded claims about my behavior, about me being inattentive, about me not being emotionally present. But none of it held up against the cold, hard facts of the case. It was clear now, Emily was trying to play the victim. She wanted the court to pity her, to see her as someone who had been wronged, instead of the woman who had betrayed her husband, humiliated him publicly, and stolen from him in the process. But the reality was far different. Emily's attempts to shift the blame back onto me were futile. Greg shredded her counterclaim, piece by piece, dismantling her arguments with evidence that exposed her lies. She was trying to spin the narrative, but she couldn't hide the truth. Her affair wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, it was a deliberate and ongoing betrayal. And now, the truth was out there for everyone to see. As Emily sat there, seething with frustration, I realized something. She thought she could get away with everything. She thought she could manipulate the system and walk away with everything she wanted. But now, she was finally being exposed for who she really was. The counterclaim had been filed, but it wouldn't save her. The days that followed Emily's counterclaim were tense. Both sides of the courtroom were preparing for what would be the final round. The fact that she had admitted to infidelity, and that the child wasn't mine, should have been a knockout blow, but Emily was not the type to surrender easily. She still had one last card to play, the one that could destroy me emotionally and financially. I could tell that she was grasping at straws. Emily had always been a master manipulator, but now, with everything on the line, I saw her at her most dangerous. Every conversation we had outside of court was tense. She seemed to think she could still win, even after all the damage she'd done. Maybe she thought I was weak, or maybe she simply couldn't accept the reality of what was happening. Either way, it was clear that her delusions hadn't yet been shattered. But things were about to take a sharp turn, and I was ready for it. I had my own strategy. While she focused on trying to salvage her dignity, I had been quietly gathering more ammunition, tactical, emotional, and financial. I had no intention of letting her walk away with even an inch more than she deserved. On the morning of the final trial, the courthouse was filled with anticipation. The air in the courtroom felt thick, as though everyone knew that this was the last chance for both parties to make their final statements. Emily was sitting across from me, her lawyer still by her side, both of them wearing their usual masks of confidence. But I knew better. They were running on fumes now. Emily had nothing left to hide, and I was going to make sure she knew it. As I sat there, Greg leaned over and whispered in my ear. "We've got them, John. This is it. Let's finish this." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to keep calm. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. I wasn't going to let Emily continue to manipulate the situation, not when she had already destroyed everything we had built together. The judge, Judge Olivia Smith, entered the courtroom and banged her gavel, calling the final session to order. She wasted no time in laying out the parameters for today's proceedings. "Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, this case has gone on for quite some time. It's clear that the facts are no longer in dispute. What we need to focus on now is the resolution. We will hear your final arguments." I could feel my pulse quicken. This was it. The final argument. Emily's lawyer, Laura Jennings, stood up first, preparing to make her case. I could tell she had been on edge ever since Emily's admission in the counterclaim. Laura wasn't used to losing, and she certainly wasn't used to having to fight for a cause that had been so clearly shattered. Laura adjusted her glasses, then started her spiel with a practiced tone. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Lawson, has been subjected to years of emotional abuse. She was forced into a marriage with Mr. Lawson that, while initially full of love, turned toxic and intolerable. The affair was the result of neglect, and it was not a one-time incident, but rather a cry for help." She continued to paint Emily as the victim, portraying her affair as a misguided escape from an allegedly oppressive marriage. She argued that I had been emotionally unavailable, inattentive, and distant, but Greg was ready for this. He was prepared to cut through the lies with surgical precision. "Your Honor," Greg interjected as Laura spoke, "I have to respectfully disagree. What we have here is a series of deliberate actions taken by Mrs. Lawson, actions that have been documented, verified, and corroborated. We're not talking about an isolated incident, but a pattern of deception, dishonesty, and betrayal. The affair was not a cry for help, as Mrs. Jennings claims. It was a calculated decision made over a long period of time, and it involved multiple partners. Mrs. Lawson's attempt to present herself as a victim is disingenuous." The courtroom fell silent as Greg's words sank in. There was no comeback for this. Emily's lawyer was out of ammunition. Laura had tried to claim emotional abuse, but the evidence presented showed that it was Emily who had systematically abused the trust in our marriage, not the other way around. As Greg continued to dismantle Emily's defense, I sat there, steeling myself for the next phase. I couldn't let my emotions get the better of me, no matter how much I wanted to scream at Emily for everything she had put me through. I kept my eyes trained on the judge, knowing that the moment I spoke would be crucial. The judge turned to me. "Mr. Lawson, do you have anything further to add?" I stood up slowly, my body tense with a mixture of anger and relief. I had waited for this moment, for the chance to speak my truth. The words I was about to say would carry weight, and I knew that this was my final opportunity to let Emily, and the court, understand exactly what she had done. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion, "I've spent years trying to save my marriage. I've been blindsided by lies and betrayal from someone I trusted more than anything. I've watched the woman I loved tear apart everything we built together. But the truth is, this isn't just about a divorce. This is about a person who has no regard for anyone but herself. Emily's actions didn't just affect me, they affected our child, our family, and every person who thought they knew the woman she really was. I turned to face Emily, locking eyes with her. For the first time in this entire process, I could see the cracks in her facade. She was breaking down, her face flushed with frustration, but there was nothing she could do to stop the tide of truth that was sweeping over her. Emily, you may have thought you could get away with everything. You may have thought you could lie, cheat, and manipulate your way out of the consequences. But the truth has a way of coming out. And now, you have to face the consequences of your actions. You don't get to rewrite our history. I paused for a moment, letting my words hang in the air before continuing. I'm not here to tear you down. I'm here because I need to protect my child. And that means ensuring that you face the full consequences of your betrayal. The courtroom was silent, the weight of my words settling over everyone. Even Emily's lawyer, Laura, seemed to recognize the futility of her defense. Emily sat there, her eyes downcast, unable to respond. Judge Smith looked at us both for a long moment before speaking. Mr. and Mrs. Lawson, it's clear that the circumstances of this case are dire, and the evidence presented is undeniable. I will take everything into consideration before making my final ruling. This session is adjourned for today. I will issue a ruling in the coming days. As we filed out of the courtroom, I could feel a strange sense of finality wash over me. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time, I felt confident that Emily wouldn't escape the consequences of her actions. The next few days passed in a haze of uncertainty and anticipation. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories of Emily, of everything we'd been through, and of the life that was slipping further away from me with each passing moment. The pain of betrayal still burned, but there was also a deep, growing sense of relief. No matter what the outcome of this trial, I knew I was finally doing the right thing. It was Wednesday afternoon when I received the call from Greg Miller. His voice was calm but heavy with the gravity of what he was about to tell me. John, the judge has made her ruling. We'll be going to court in the morning for the final verdict. I'll need you there. Be prepared. Those words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been preparing for months, but now, in this final moment, the full weight of what was about to happen started to sink in. Emily's fate, our fate, was about to be sealed. The night before the ruling, I didn't sleep. Instead, I spent hours pacing back and forth in my apartment, reliving every moment of my marriage, of Emily's betrayals, and of the lies I'd been told. I remembered the way she'd promised me she loved me, how she'd begged me for forgiveness time and time again when I had caught her in her lies, the way she manipulated every situation, all in an attempt to maintain control. But now, the truth was finally out. The mask was off, and there was no going back. The next morning, I stood in front of the courthouse, feeling a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. As I walked into the courtroom, I saw Emily and her lawyer already seated. Emily was staring straight ahead, her face expressionless, but I could sense the fury bubbling just beneath the surface. She wasn't the woman I'd married anymore. No, this was a woman who was desperate to maintain some semblance of control over a situation she had lost. Greg was by my side, as always, his presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone in this fight. He gave me a reassuring nod as we sat down. Judge Olivia Smith entered the room promptly, her demeanor businesslike as always. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. The court proceedings began almost immediately. Mr. Lawson, Mrs. Lawson, the judge said, looking at both of us, her voice steady and authoritative. This has been a long and difficult case, with emotions running high. It's time for me to issue my ruling. Please allow me a moment. The room was silent as she flipped through her notes, the only sound the faint rustling of paper. I could feel Emily's gaze on me, but I refused to look at her. This was not about her anymore. This was about what was just, what was fair. After what felt like an eternity, Judge Smith looked up and met our eyes. "I have considered all the evidence carefully. Mr. Lawson, you have provided a compelling argument, and the court has fully reviewed the circumstances surrounding your marriage, the infidelity, the child's paternity, and the financial matters at hand. Mrs. Lawson, your actions, as revealed by the evidence, are nothing short of a betrayal of trust, and I am not swayed by your attempts to manipulate this court." I could see Emily tense at the judge's words, but she didn't interrupt. She knew she had no ground left to stand on. "The court finds in favor of Mr. Lawson," Judge Smith continued. "The child in question, as per the paternity test, is not his. Mrs. Lawson, you will bear the full financial responsibility for the child's care and well-being. In addition, the court finds that your actions, specifically, the infidelity, the manipulation, and the deliberate deceit, have undermined the foundation of your marriage. Mr. Lawson will retain full ownership of the marital property, including the house, the savings, and any shared assets." The words hit me like a wave of cold water. Relief, yes, but also a sense of finality. This was really happening. The battle was over, and I had won, finally. But it wasn't over yet. There was one last twist to come, one last act of vengeance that Emily had up her sleeve. "I must also address the financial aspect of this case," Judge Smith said, her voice firm. "Mr. Lawson, I'm aware that there are joint debts in this marriage, including the substantial credit card balances and the mortgage. The court orders that these debts be split equally between you and Mrs. Lawson. You will both be responsible for paying off these debts." I felt a pang of bitterness. It wasn't a huge surprise, but it wasn't something I had expected either. Emily had always been irresponsible with money, often maxing out credit cards and taking on debt without any consideration for the consequences. Now, we were both going to bear the weight of that. But what struck me the hardest was Emily's face as the judge made the final pronouncement. She had been quiet throughout the ruling, but now, her expression was one of pure hatred. Her eyes burned with fury, but there was something else there too, a recognition of defeat. She had lost. Not just the property, not just the financial assets. She had lost her power over me. She had lost the control she had held for so many years. "Mrs. Lawson," Judge Smith added, her voice cutting through the tension in the room, "the court recognizes that your actions have caused irreversible damage to your marriage, and therefore, I am also imposing a financial penalty. You will be required to pay a fine, which will be taken from your personal assets." I could see the blood drain from Emily's face as she processed the judge's words. A fine. That was it. All her manipulations, all her lies, all her deceit, and all she was left with was a fine. I could barely contain the satisfaction that washed over me as I watched her struggle to maintain her composure. "Mr. Lawson," Judge Smith continued, "I understand the emotional toll this case has taken on you, but please know that the financial responsibility you now share with your ex-wife will require your cooperation. Both of you will need to come to a resolution on these matters in the coming weeks." Greg leaned over to me and whispered, "We did it, John. It's over." As we stood to leave, I couldn't help but take one last look at Emily. Her once confident, smug expression was gone. She was a woman stripped bare, and I knew she had nothing left to fight for. She had burned every bridge, and now, the consequences of her actions were coming down on her like a hammer. I wasn't sure what Emily's future would look like, but I knew one thing for certain: she would never again control me. The days after the judgment were a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe again. The legal battle was behind me, and the weight of it all had been lifted. Emily had lost, but I knew this wasn't over. No, she wasn't the type to let go of something without making one final, vicious attempt to regain control. It didn't take long for the storm to hit. 2 weeks after the court's ruling, I received another letter from Emily's lawyer. The envelope was thin, almost casual, but I knew better. I had seen that type of envelope before, an official counterclaim. My heart sank as I tore it open and read the letter that followed. Notice of intent to appeal and file a counterclaim for damages. It wasn't the first time Emily had tried to flip the script, but this was different. She wasn't just going to take the loss lying down, she was going to make sure I paid for it. She was determined to drag me back into the courtroom. I immediately called Greg, my lawyer, and told him what had happened. He didn't sound surprised, but there was a trace of frustration in his voice. "John, this was always coming. Emily's too proud to let this go without a fight. But we'll beat her again. Just stay calm. We'll file a counterclaim of our own." It was as if Greg had read my mind. Emily's counterclaim wasn't just about money. It was about revenge. She wanted to drag me through the mud again, to make me relive the pain of our marriage. I could almost see her sitting in her lawyer's office, plotting her next move, perhaps even enjoying the thought of me in a courtroom once more. But I wasn't going to let her win again. The counterclaim she filed was as elaborate as it was vindictive. She accused me of being an irresponsible, negligent husband who had emotionally abandoned her. She argued that the marriage had been irreparably damaged by my lack of support, and that I had been emotionally abusive in ways that I had never even imagined. She even went so far as to claim that I had neglected her needs, both emotional and physical, pushing her into the arms of another man. Of course, she conveniently left out the fact that she had been the one who had cheated on me multiple times, including with her boss, Mark, and several others, which she had never admitted in court. But it wasn't just the lies she was spreading. Emily demanded that I relinquish the rest of the property, my car, my retirement savings, everything I had worked so hard to build. It was a desperate move, one that came from a place of pure malice. She wanted to make sure I had nothing left. As if that wasn't enough, Emily tried to play the victim card, claiming that the stress of the divorce and the court case had caused her significant emotional distress. She was looking for a payout, and not just any payout, a substantial one that would leave me struggling for years to come. I knew I had to act fast. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a psychological one, and Emily was hoping to break me. Greg was adamant about one thing: we needed to prepare ourselves for war. He instructed me to gather every piece of evidence, every email, every text message, and every document that would prove Emily's infidelity. It was time for her to face the full consequences of her actions. For the next few days, I spent hours going through old files, rereading texts between Emily and her lovers, and collecting evidence that would tear apart her fabricated narrative. I even contacted the private investigator we had hired during the earlier stages of our divorce proceedings to see if there was anything they had missed. But it wasn't just the evidence that was important, it was the strategy. Greg advised me to hold nothing back. We would show the court the full extent of Emily's betrayal, and this time, there would be no hiding behind false accusations. The truth would come out, and the judge would see Emily for who she truly was. The next trial date was set. The courtroom would be our battleground, and I was ready. On the day of the counterclaim hearing, I arrived early, determined to stay calm. I had a new sense of clarity, as though a fog had been lifted. Emily might be trying to drag me back into the depths of our toxic marriage, but I wasn't going to let her. This time, I was going to finish this for good. As I entered the courtroom, I saw her sitting there, her eyes cold and calculating. She had changed her appearance once again, cutting her hair into a sleek bob and wearing an expensive-looking black dress that screamed power. She looked like the woman she had always wanted to be, successful, independent, and in control. But I knew better. Beneath that polished exterior was the same woman who had lied, cheated, and manipulated her way through our marriage. Her lawyer, a sharp, experienced woman named Samantha Fields, was seated next to her. I had met Samantha before, and I knew she would stop at nothing to help Emily win. She was a formidable opponent, but she had underestimated me once already. She wasn't going to get away with it this time. Greg was with me, his expression stern but composed. He was ready for battle, and I could see the fire in his eyes as he prepared to take down Emily's counterclaim. The proceedings began, and the judge, Judge Olivia Smith, wasted no time. She addressed both sides, her eyes moving from Emily to me as she made it clear that the court would not tolerate frivolous claims or emotional manipulations. "Mrs. Lawson," Judge Smith began, "you are accusing Mr. Lawson of neglecting his duties as a husband, but you have failed to address the core issue, the infidelity that led to the dissolution of this marriage. You have also failed to provide sufficient evidence that Mr. Lawson was abusive or neglectful. Your accusations seem more focused on securing a financial payout than on presenting a valid claim." Emily's lawyer, Samantha Fields, attempted to argue that my behavior was the cause of her emotional distress, but the judge was not having it. Greg was ready with our rebuttal. We had gathered everything, from the texts between Emily and Mark to the testimony of the private investigator. It was time for Emily to face the truth. As Greg laid out the evidence, Emily's facade began to crack. I watched her carefully, noting the subtle tremors in her hands and the way her gaze flickered toward me when certain texts were read aloud in the courtroom. She knew she was losing. She knew I was about to expose her for the fraud she was. "Your Honor," Greg said, as he handed the final piece of evidence to the judge, "this text message, sent by Mrs. Lawson to Mr. Lawson's best friend, clearly shows that she was not only engaging in an affair but was also attempting to manipulate Mr. Lawson's emotions for financial gain." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Emily's face turned an ashen color as the weight of her lies crushed her. The silence in the courtroom was almost suffocating as the final text message was read aloud. Emily's face twisted in disbelief, a mix of anger and humiliation flashing across her features. For a moment, she looked like she was about to break down. It was almost satisfying to see her finally losing control in front of a room full of people who had once believed her lies. The message was damning, a casual, almost flippant text to her lover, Mark, talking about how she had handled me, how she was going to manipulate me into giving her more of the property in the divorce. It was clear proof of her deceit, her callous disregard for our marriage, and the lengths to which she had gone to manipulate me. Samantha Fields, Emily's lawyer, was visibly flustered. She quickly objected, trying to argue that the text message was taken out of context, but the judge wasn't having it. Judge Smith, who had been impartial up until that moment, finally leaned forward, her voice stern. "Mrs. Lawson," Judge Smith said, her tone dripping with authority, "this text message paints a very different picture from the one you've presented. You've accused Mr. Lawson of neglect and emotional abandonment, but your own actions tell a completely different story. This is not a case of an emotionally neglected wife seeking justice, this is a case of a woman who has actively sought to manipulate, deceive, and financially exploit her husband. I will be considering this evidence very carefully." I could see Emily's confidence begin to crack. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her perfect posture faltering as the full weight of her actions hit her. The mask she had worked so hard to maintain was falling apart, revealing the truth of her betrayal. Greg leaned in, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "Your Honor, this text message is just the tip of the iceberg. We have a stack of evidence, photos, video recordings, and testimonies, that further corroborate the fact that Mrs. Lawson's claims are completely baseless. Not only did she engage in multiple affairs throughout our marriage, but she has also lied under oath in this courtroom. This entire counterclaim is an attempt to cover up her actions and shift blame onto my client, who has been nothing but patient and fair throughout this process." I watched as Emily's face flushed with anger, but there was nothing she could do now. The truth was out. And though she tried to keep her composure, I could see the fear in her eyes. It was clear that the judge had seen through her. She was no longer the woman she had pretended to be, no longer the victim she had carefully crafted for months. Samantha Fields tried to salvage the situation, but it was clear the damage had already been done. She attempted to shift the focus, arguing that the financial issues were still unresolved, that I was not fulfilling my responsibilities as a father, and that I was not considering Emily's emotional well-being. But the judge, who had been steadily listening, finally spoke again. "I've seen enough. Mrs. Lawson, I strongly advise you to reconsider the counterclaim. If you wish to pursue this further, I suggest you prepare for a second trial. But let me be clear, if your intentions are to continue down this path of deceit and manipulation, you will not find this court sympathetic." The tension in the room was palpable. Emily sat frozen, her eyes darting between the judge and me, as though trying to calculate what to do next. She had been caught in her web of lies, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. But it wasn't over yet. The judge's words weren't an ultimatum, they were a warning. Emily could file for a second trial if she wished, but the outcome would likely be even worse for her. Her credibility was shattered, and the truth had come to light in ways she hadn't anticipated. The judge turned to me and Greg. "Mr. Lawson, your counterclaim will be reviewed, and I will issue a ruling soon. However, I can assure you that I will consider the entire history of this case, including the deceitful actions that Mrs. Lawson has now admitted to. You will not be taken advantage of any further in this matter." I nodded, trying to hold my composure, but inside, I felt a sense of relief. Emily was going to lose this battle, just like she had lost every other fight she had picked against me. It wasn't just about the property or the money anymore, it was about justice. It was about making sure that she couldn't continue to manipulate and lie her way out of the consequences of her actions. The courtroom was dismissed, and as I walked out with Greg, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. This wasn't the end, but it was a major turning point. I had exposed her for the liar she was, and there was no going back for her now. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, the looks on Emily's face, the satisfaction of knowing that she had finally been exposed. But there was something else on my mind too, my son, Jason. He had been the one constant in all of this. No matter how chaotic things had become, no matter how much Emily had tried to destroy me, he had always been there, needing me. He deserved better than the mess I had allowed our marriage to become. I had to focus on him. I had to make sure that when this was all over, we would be okay. But I knew I wasn't done yet. Emily wasn't going to give up without a fight. And the next trial, the one where the final judgment would be made, was still ahead of me. The days following the courtroom drama felt like a strange limbo. Emily had been humiliated, but I knew her well enough to understand that she wasn't going to back down without a fight. She'd been on the losing end of a public spectacle, but she was still dangerous, still capable of hurting me if given the chance. Her counterclaim had failed spectacularly. The judge had seen through her lies and manipulation, but she wasn't one to accept defeat so easily. She still had her pride, and she still had her plan to drain every last cent from me. In the weeks that followed, she retreated into silence. I knew it was just a matter of time before she made her next move. I focused on what mattered most, Jason. My son was my anchor through this storm. He'd been a quiet observer during the divorce proceedings, and though he was only 11, I could see the impact this was having on him. I made a conscious effort to spend more time with him, to take him to his soccer games, to just be there. I couldn't let him see me consumed by anger or revenge. But even though I was trying to rebuild the pieces of my life, Emily was not done with me. She continued to spread rumors, to undermine me, and to make sure that everyone in her circle knew the version of the story she had created. She even contacted my family, trying to convince them that I was the one who had been unreasonable, that I was the one who had caused the breakdown of our marriage. I didn't care. It was all part of the game she played, the same game that had led her to betray me in the first place. She was good at manipulating people, good at twisting the truth to fit her narrative. But the truth had already come to light in court, and nothing could change that. Still, I wasn't naive enough to think that everything was over. The final trial was still ahead of us, and I knew Emily would do whatever it took to keep fighting. She would push me to the edge, try to wear me down, and see if I would break. But I had already been broken once, during the months of her lies and betrayal, and I had come out of it stronger. The day of the final hearing arrived, and with it, the last battle in our war. Emily was in full form that morning, her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and she was dressed in a high-end suit that screamed confidence. She was putting on her best act, pretending to be the victim once again. But I wasn't fooled. I had seen her for who she truly was. Greg and I sat in the waiting area outside the courtroom, going over our final strategy. This was it, the end of a long and brutal journey. I could feel the tension in the air, but I also knew that we had the upper hand. We had already exposed Emily's lies in the earlier hearing, and there was no way for her to recover from that. As we entered the courtroom, I could see that Emily was already there, sitting beside her lawyer, Samantha Fields. They both looked up as we entered, but Emily's gaze quickly shifted away from me. She couldn't look me in the eye, not after everything that had been exposed. Judge Smith entered the courtroom, her presence commanding immediate attention. The proceedings began quickly, and I could sense that the judge was ready to wrap this up once and for all. She had been patient throughout the trial, but I knew she had seen enough to make her decision. "Mr. Lawson," Judge Smith began, turning to me, "I have reviewed all of the evidence presented in this case, including the counterclaim filed by Mrs. Lawson. The claims she has made are baseless, and there is no evidence to support her accusations of neglect and abuse. In fact, the evidence presented in this case suggests that Mrs. Lawson's actions have been far from honorable." Emily's face tightened as the judge spoke. Her eyes narrowed in a mixture of anger and disbelief, but she stayed silent. She knew she had lost. "Mrs. Lawson," Judge Smith continued, "your actions have caused significant harm to your husband and your son. The evidence shows that you have engaged in multiple extramarital affairs and have been dishonest with this court. I find it troubling that you continue to deny the truth of your behavior." There was no escaping it now. Emily had been caught in her lies, and the judge wasn't about to let her walk away without facing the consequences. Therefore, Judge Smith said, her voice firm, "I am ruling in favor of Mr. Lawson. The financial settlement will remain as previously decided, and I will also grant Mr. Lawson full custody of your son, Jason. You will be required to pay child support, and any further claims for property will be denied." I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over me. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when Emily's manipulation and deceit finally came to an end. Emily's face twisted in fury. She stood up suddenly, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. Her voice was sharp as she turned to the judge. "This is unjust," she cried, her voice breaking. "I've done nothing wrong. He's the one who. Her words trailed off as she looked around the courtroom, her gaze flitting to the people who had been watching the trial unfold. She realized, in that moment, that there was no one left to believe her. The game was over. Samantha Fields, her lawyer, tried to intervene, but Judge Smith raised a hand, signaling that the proceedings were finished. Emily's outburst was nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage some shred of dignity, but it fell flat. The judge's ruling was final. With the trial concluded, I felt a strange sense of finality. The years of pain, the sleepless nights, the emotional roller coaster, it was all over. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt lighter than I had in years. My son, Jason, was waiting for me outside, his face lighting up when he saw me. He ran to me and wrapped his arms around me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had everything I needed. The days after the final trial were strange. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the chaos of the divorce and the courtroom drama slowly began to wear off. I had won the battle, yes, but the real victory, reclaiming my life, my peace of mind, and my relationship with Jason, was just beginning. Emily, for all her grand plans and manipulation, had been left with the scraps. She would have to pay child support, and she was no longer entitled to the property she had fought so hard to take. More importantly, she had been stripped of any semblance of dignity in the eyes of the court. The truth about her infidelity was laid bare, and she would have to live with that for the rest of her life. I don't know if she fully understood the depth of the consequences. For a while, I was convinced that Emily was beyond redemption, that she would never face the truth of what she had done to our family. But over time, I began to see her differently. She wasn't just a woman who had betrayed me, she was someone who had been broken long before I ever knew her. Maybe she had never really known how to love. Jason and I settled into a new routine. He was a resilient kid, but even he couldn't fully avoid the fallout of the divorce. School was difficult for him at first. The other kids whispered behind his back, and there were times when he would come home with his head down, clearly affected by the tension. But as the weeks passed, Jason found his footing. He started spending more time with me, more time doing the things we used to enjoy before everything fell apart. I was determined not to let Emily's actions poison the good things left in my life. Jason deserved better than that. He deserved stability, love, and a father who could be present for him in every way that counted. The house we moved into was smaller, but it was ours. It had a warm, cozy feel to it, something I had never quite experienced in the house we had shared with Emily. The rooms were filled with Jason's artwork, his sports trophies, and pictures of the two of us, reminders that we were a family, and we always would be, even if things had changed. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when I'd catch myself thinking about Emily, wondering if there had been a chance for us, if we could have saved our marriage. But those thoughts were fleeting now, replaced by the realization that I was better off without her. She had burned too many bridges, lied too many times, and put me and Jason through far too much pain. The financial settlement from the divorce, while substantial, didn't matter as much as I had expected it to. Emily had tried to ruin me, but in the end, all she had done was set me free. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the sense of peace I had finally begun to feel. I was no longer trapped in her lies, no longer living in a toxic relationship that had drained me for years. One evening, after dinner, I sat down with Jason in the living room. We watched a movie, something light-hearted, a comedy to take his mind off everything that had happened. As the credits rolled, Jason looked up at me and smiled, a rare, genuine smile that made my heart swell. "You're doing a good job, Dad," he said, his voice soft but sincere. I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Thanks, kiddo. I'm just trying to make sure you have a good life." "You're doing it," he replied. In that moment, I knew that despite everything we had been through, everything that had been ripped away from us, we would be okay. It wasn't about the property, or the money, or even the drama of the divorce. It was about us, Jason and me. We had each other, and that was enough. As time passed, Emily faded from our lives. We didn't see her much. She would call occasionally, but I didn't take those calls. I didn't need her in my life anymore, and I certainly didn't need her interfering with my relationship with Jason. She had made her choices, and now it was time for me to move on from the wreckage she had left behind. Months later, I began to think about the future. Jason and I were doing better than I could have hoped. We had a routine, a rhythm to our days, and while I still occasionally had moments of doubt, of wondering if I had made the right choices, those thoughts no longer consumed me. I started to date again. It wasn't something I had thought much about during the divorce. But with time, I realized I could open my heart to someone new. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, and maybe it wouldn't be perfect, but I could give it a shot. One day, while Jason was at a friend's house, I went on a date with a woman named Sarah. She was warm, intelligent, and had a calming presence that made me feel comfortable. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Emily, hope. It wasn't a fairy tale beginning, but it was a step forward. I wasn't looking for a perfect relationship, I was looking for something real, something grounded. And maybe, just maybe, I could find that again. I knew there would be more challenges ahead. Life would always throw curveballs, and the scars of my marriage to Emily would never fully fade. But I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever came my way. I wasn't the same man I had been when I walked into that courtroom. I had been tested, broken, and rebuilt. And now, I was stronger than ever before. Jason and I were in a better place. We had overcome the worst of it. The scars would always be there, but they were reminders of how far we had come. And together, we would keep moving forward, no matter what. For the first time in years, I could finally breathe.